Florida Bulldog actually puts out an article entitled Abu Ghraib torture lawsuit against multi-billion-dollar U.S. Army contractor, which is headed for trial. Four people who were actually at Abu Ghraib have filed a lawsuit against CACI, uh, CACI Premier Technologies, which is basically a company that the CIA contracted for these torture sessions at Abu Ghraib. Four people named in the lawsuit are Suhail Najim Abdallah Al-Shimari, who's headed in the case. It's actually Al-Shimari versus CACI Premier. The other defendants are Assad Hamza Hamfoush Dubali, Salad Hassan Nasrallah Ali Jali, and Taha Yassin Araj Rashid. All these people were at Abu Ghraib and tortured mercilessly. But I like to get right to the point, to the article itself, and let's read along together and see what we can basically come out of, get out of this article by Dan Christensen once again. 20 years after the U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq in the wake of 9/11, a lawsuit against a company that provided interrogator services for the U.S. Army at the notorious Abu Ghraib prison finally seems headed to trial. U.S. District Judge Leonie Brinkema of the Eastern District of Virginia, in a little noted order on July 31st, denied defendant CACI Premier Technology Incorporated's motion to dismiss the case. Lawsuit was brought by the New York-based Center for Constitutional Rights in 2008 on behalf of three former Abu Ghraib detainees, all Iraqis, who contend that they were wrongly imprisoned and tortured in 2003-2004. They were eventually released without any criminal charge filed against them. The suit contends that CACI conspired with and aided and abetted U.S. military personnel in subjecting the plaintiffs to illegal conduct, including war crimes and torture. U.S. military investigators concluded years ago that CACI interrogators conspired with U.S. soldiers to soften up imprisoned Iraqis. The U.S. Army investigation referred to the shocking treatment of detainees at Abu Ghraib near Baghdad as sadistic, blatant, wanted. Several low-level military officers were court-martialed for their roles in the torture. CACI has gone unpunished, according to the Center for Constitutional Rights. Likewise, CACI continues to collect billions of dollars in government contracts. For example, on Thursday, CACI announced that the National Security Agency had awarded the company a $2.7 billion contract to provide intelligence analysis. Shares of Reston, Virginia-based CACI International, with a market capitalization of more than $8 billion, are publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The company generates more than $6 billion in annual revenue, according to Market Beat. CACI spokeswoman could not be reached for comment, but CACI has repeatedly insisted it's not liable for the torture. According to a CCR press release, CACI has sought to have the case dismissed 18 times, being rebuffed 4 times by the Court of Appeals, by the Fourth Circuit, as well as by the Supreme Court. For its latest challenges, CACI invoked the Supreme Court's 2021 decision in Doe versus Nestle, which addressed the scopes of the Alien Tort Statute, and 3 unrelated Supreme Court cases in 2022 on a basis for dismissal, the press release says. In a 2018 ruling, the district court held that the treatment alleged by the men in Abu Ghraib constituted torture, war crimes, and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. The ATS gives U.S. federal courts jurisdiction over civil actions brought by foreign nationals alleging violations of international law. Judge Brinkema ruling has cleared the way almost 20 years hence for our clients to tell the story in open court, said Center for Constitutional Rights legal director Bahir Azmi. Brinkema temporarily sealed her order because it cites from sealed material in the case. She told the parties to meet within 7 days to notify the court of what parts of her order must be redacted. Redactions must be minimal, given the public's right to access court opinions, and unjustified redactions will be rejected, she wrote. The 3 plaintiffs seeking unspecified damages are Suhail Al-Shimari, Assad Al-Zubayr, and Salah Al-Ijali. Al-Shimari, a farmer, was held at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere for more than 4 years. He was caged, threatened with dogs, subjected to beatings and electrical shocks, threatened with death and being sent to a faraway place, according to CCR. Salah Ali Jolly lives in Sweden with his wife and 3 children and has worked as a reporter for Al Jazeera News Network, according to CCR. In November 2003, Ali Jolly was working with Al Jazeera when he traveled to Iraq's Diyala province to report on an explosion. He was detained by U.S. military personnel and 5 days later transferred to Abu Ghraib for about 6 weeks, where he was allegedly subjected to a campaign of mental and physical torture and other serious mistreatment. Torture took different forms, including undressing, being caged like animals, using dogs for intimidation, banning foods and drinks, hand to foot cuffing, physical humiliation, sexual harassment, and many others. My body was like a machine, responding to all external orders, Al-Jali told CCR. The only part I owned was my brain, which could not be stopped by the black plastic bag they used to cover my head. The most important question to which I could find no answer at the time is, what is all this for? After being told of Judge Brinkima's ruling, Al-Jali told CCR, I'm so happy to receive the news that our case can proceed to a trial. I have stayed patient and hopeful during the 2 years we have waited for this decision, and throughout the nearly 2 decades since I was abused at Abu Ghraib, that one day I would achieve justice and accountability in the U.S. court. Today brings me and the other plaintiffs one step closer. Now, regarding the history of what is going on here, we have to go to the court case itself. And what I'm going to do is basically read from U.S. Al-Shimari versus CACI Premier Technology Incorporated. Here's the introductory text. The case presents 2 court opinions concerning the treatment of former Abu Ghraib detainees by private military companies, CACI Premier Technology. And if you scroll, by the way, all the stuff I'm reading is going to be at the bottom of the description. But when you go all the way down to the notes here, right? So you go down to the notes, and I'll read from here, which I'm going to basically blow up one more time so this way you could see it for yourself. Following the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the United States took control of Abu Ghraib prison, a facility located near Baghdad, Iraq, that previously was under the control of Saddam Hussein. Upon assuming control of the facility, the United States military used the prison to detain criminals, enemies of the provisional government, and other persons held for interrogation related to intelligence gathering. Due to a shortage of military interrogators, the United States government entered into a contract with CACI Premier Technology to provide additional interrogation services at Abu Ghraib. Here you have evidence showing that the United States government went to CACI Premier Technology and actually entered in an agreement, a contractual agreement with this company in servicing interrogators. And CACI International can deny all they want that we're not liable for torture. Well, yes, you are. You entered in an agreement with the United States government and the CIA regarding the torture practices and the methods used in these torture practices. I'm not even using enhanced interrogation techniques. It's a fancy term for torture. And when you go down a little bit, the plaintiffs allege in their complaint that CACI interrogators entered into a conspiracy with low-ranking military police officials to commit abusive acts on the plaintiffs in order to soften up the detainees so that they would be more responsive during later interrogations. The plaintiffs further alleged that they were victims of a wide range of mistreatment, including beatings, choking, subjected to electrical shocks, repeatedly shot in the head with a taser gun, forcibly subjected to sexual acts, subjected to sensory deprivation, placed in stress positions for extended periods of time, deprived of food, water, and sleep, threatened with unreleased dogs and death, and forced to wear women's underwear. It says more about the people perpetrating these crimes than it does the detainees. The real animals are not the Iraqis, are not the Arabs. It's you, the American contractors. Additionally, the plaintiffs allege that CACI interrogators instigated, directed, participated in, encouraged, and aided and abetted conduct towards detainees that clearly violated the Geneva Conventions, the Army Field Manual, and the laws of the United States. The plaintiffs contend that these acts of abuse were possible because of a command vacuum at Abu Ghraib caused by the failure of military leaders to exercise effective oversight over CACI interrogators and military police. Now, in regards to why this happened, there are two areas I like to concentrate on. One is the November 13th, 2001 memo, in which I have stated in previous videos that White House counsel, people like John Yoo, Alberto Gonzales, and Cheney's private lawyer, David Addington, that sanctioned the Bush White House and gave the White House sole authority to decide what constitutes a terrorist, terrorism, and who will be tried at military commissions. Because what they didn't want was basically to bring detainees labeled as terrorists by the president. By the way, that was the job of the Department of Justice. In other words, a domestic agency like the FBI, Department of Justice, arrests a suspect based on evidence showing that this person is a terrorist. Evidence that shows that this person conspired, facilitated, participated in. What these White House lawyers knew was that they didn't want to go the legal route. They wanted to go an illegal route and make it legal. So what they did was, anyone who is, they'll override the Department of Justice and give the sole authority to the President of the United States, expanding his War Powers Act. Because according to the White House counsel, the United States is at war. Remember, the Pentagon was hit by a terrorist driving a plane into it, not the World Trade Center or Shanksville. We were at war, according to Department of Defense and Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, right? So the Pentagon and White House legal counsel are pressuring the Bush White House to circumvent the Constitution, override the Geneva Conventions, override the Army Field Manual, and override all domestic laws protecting people from being subjected to prosecution, which are basically now at the hands of the President of the United States. And so these people like John Yoo and David Addington, they actually committed the worst crimes because they gave unchecked federal authority to the President of the United States, overriding the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. This is the reason why Secretary of State Colin Powell, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, and John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, went to Dick Cheney, the Vice President, because Bush, in the month of November, went on vacation in 2001 because he's such a weakling. Cheney is more rough and ardent and more politically astute. And they said, you can't do this. And Cheney basically argued, saying, well, yes, I can, because I got the authority of the president. The memo itself that was drafted in November of 2001, states that they are ignoring international law, that they suggest the president could abide by it or not, and that anyone labeled a terrorist by the President of the United States would not be afforded protection by the Geneva Convention. And what this meant was that any foreign nation that the president deemed as a nation that allowed terrorists, which is a loosely defined label, if they were living in it or conspired in terrorism, would come under prosecution and attack, if need be, military invasion. Now, what happened just a month prior, 2 weeks prior, there was another piece of legislation that was passed, which is the Patriot Act. And there are a lot of problems with the Patriot Act, including a number of titles, 10 in all, that were rewritten over time. And the Patriot Act basically is a long piece of legislation that's been written probably 15, 20 years prior to the events of 9/11, and just given written authority by Congress in which the current president of the United States, was a co-signer of. And I'm not going to read you there's so many provisions that are like abusive towards civil liberties. But one of that's relating to this story is that one of the more controversial aspects of the Patriot Act is the immigration provisions that allow for the indefinite detention of any alien who the Attorney General believes may cause a terrorist act. And then when that memo was written in November, there was a separate memo that I read, that I talked about, that bypassed the Attorney General, that was written by White House legal counsel. Now, there have been a lot of human rights violations afforded to the victims of the Patriot Act, and that there was one outspoken person, Anita Ramaswamy, who's an associate professor of law at the Schindler Center of Law, Commerce, and Technology at the University of Washington. And she actually said in an article dated October 25th, 2001, which was quoted by Russell Feingold, she warned that the indefinite detention upon secret evidence, which the Patriot Act allows, by the way, sounds more like the Taliban than ours, than ours, American justice, which she's right. The Patriot Act basically says that the President of the United States, the American government, can detain somebody who's suspected of terrorism, in which the November memo allows the President of the United States to basically say, well, this person is a terrorist in so-and-so country, go and get him, rendition him. They contract the CIA. CIA goes and gets that person, renditions him, not back to the United States where they're afforded Geneva Convention. No, they go to countries like Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Poland, Germany, all these that have secret CIA black prison sites. And then they're tortured by contractors like CACI International, or the SEER program by James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, all contractors by the CIA. The CIA got their authority from who? The Bush White House, Department of Defense. Now, the claims by human rights organizations that were attempting to build, and at the time, an international coalition against terrorism, was severely undermined right from the beginning, because anybody who came out against the Patriot Act, anybody who came out against the president's decisions, was deemed un-American. And at that time, with the 9/11 attacks, everybody wanted blood, because nobody was thinking with their head. Now, many people, civil rights, libertarians, civil rights advocates, people like Russell Feingold, in the statement that he made in the Senate floor, claimed that the Patriot Act falls short of meeting even with basic constitutional standards of due process and fairness. The ACLU accused the Patriot Act of giving the Attorney General unprecedented new power to determine the fate of immigrants in the United States. That's why the November memo was written for people outside the United States, overriding the Attorney General and Department of Justice. And so these provisional orders are basically given approval by the United States government. So in Dan Christensen's article, the CACI Premier Technology cannot basically say that they're not liable for torture when they were contracted by the United States government, which allowed for their contractors to torture people without mercy, without respect, without justice, or any type of U.S. legislation that affords them justice, like the Geneva Convention. These people weren't even terrorists, and yet they were released without compensation and without justice. So good on Judge Brikima for overriding the appeal by CACI Premier Technology, because they're just as guilty and they should be sued up the yin yang for what they did. And for them to basically ignore this, what is it, 18 times they filed an appeal? Disgusting. Disgusting. I hope they're ruined because of it. All right, guys, that's the latest story from Dan Christensen at the Florida Bulldog, who does amazing work. I'm going to link the story and everything else to the bottom of the description. See you in the next video. I'll keep you updated.